June 5, 1944, midnight, somewhere in southern England. The order came through under radio silence. No words, no coded instructions. Just 3 short blips across the wire, each one spaced exactly 15 seconds apart. Inside a locked Quonset hut buried beneath camouflage netting, a sergeant in a U.S. signal company nodded once, then tapped out his reply. 6 seconds of static hum and a brief squelch. That was all it took. 3 miles away, a convoy of trucks rumbled to life under full blackout. But these weren't transporting troops or ammunition. Inside the canvas covers sat carefully folded bags of air, rubberized canvas shells, shaped, painted, and stenciled to mimic the exact outlines of Sherman tanks, M10 tank destroyers, and half-tracks. The 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, the Ghost Army, was on the move. And in the shadows, Germany's most experienced intelligence officers were already rewriting their maps, watching fake radio traffic light up the ether like a swarm of locusts. They had no idea they were staring at the biggest bluff in military history. What Feldwebel Heinrich Kruger heard that morning wasn't a rifle shot or artillery barrage. It was a motor, deep and distant, throbbing like a heartbeat in the fog. It sounded heavy tanks, maybe a whole armored division. He grabbed his field glasses and scanned the gray morning beyond the hedgerows near Calais. The brush was too thick to see clearly, but he was certain. Movement, engines, wait. He shouted for his lieutenant. "Panzergruppe, they've moved north. We were right, the Americans are coming through Calais." The lieutenant peered through the glass, nodded slowly, and turned toward the command dugout. "Get it reported up. High command needs to see this now." Hours later, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance plane buzzed the coastline, snapped blurry photos of the fields behind the lines, and the silhouettes confirmed what the Wehrmacht had feared. Dozens of tanks, American, dug in, tarped over, poised for an assault. They were even flying the right flags. But not one of them was real. A mile away, Corporal Nate Goldman stood with a foot pump in one hand and a cigarette in the other. The tank at his feet, or rather, the air-filled canvas shell of one, was nearly done inflating. He squinted at the paint job. The turret was off by a foot. The tracks were drawn too thick. Didn't matter. Luftwaffe flybys wouldn't notice from 8,000 feet. "What do you think, Sergeant?" he asked, tapping the rubber barrel. "Convincing enough to get someone killed?" Sergeant Leo Conway just smirked. "Doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be enough to make a German general wet himself." They inflated 50 Shermans by nightfall. The pumps hissed like snakes, the rubber creaked in the breeze. From a distance, it looked like an armored battalion had appeared out of thin air. From the German perspective, it had. The 23rd was unlike any other unit in the U.S. Army. Artists, sound engineers, stage designers, radio technicians, and drafters, none of them infantry, but all trained to trick the enemy into seeing what wasn't there. Their radio operators mimicked chatter for entire divisions. Their engineers laid fake tracks through forests and fields. Their sound trucks blared the rumble of moving tanks, timed to speaker systems buried along hedgerows. Every part of the illusion was built on scale. One tank meant nothing. But 600. That suggested an entire corps. And the Germans believed in corps. They had built their war on the backbone of organized movement. Divisions, flanks, artillery support, panzers, and infantry working as one. So when a corps appeared on their horizon, they reacted, even when it wasn't real. Especially when it wasn't real. In Berlin, the Wehrmacht's general staff reviewed intercepted American transmissions. A flood of chatter filled the air. Unit numbers, supply counts, engineer reports, minor complaints about mud or tires or burned-out transformers. The Germans assumed no one would dare fake this much radio noise. They were wrong. In reality, the Ghost Army's radio technicians had created an entire playbook, Operators rotated call signs. They staged phony battalion roll calls. They even impersonated the specific speech patterns of known generals. The German cryptographers didn't even question it. Their graphs showed undeniable buildup near Calais. The Americans were going to land there. It was obvious. It was certain. It was wrong. The real invasion was headed for Normandy. But because of the Ghost Army's illusion, Hitler refused to shift his panzer divisions from the Pas-de-Calais sector. Even after D-Day, even after paratroopers dropped behind Normandy's hedgerows, even after beach landings had turned into a full-on assault, he waited. He thought Normandy was a feint. He was waiting for the real invasion. He thought the Ghost Army was the hammer. So he let Normandy bleed. And bleed. And bleed. A week later, Feldwebel Kruger stood on the same ridge outside Calais and frowned. The tanks hadn't moved. They hadn't even left tracks. Something felt off. His lieutenant was growing nervous. "We should have seen a push by now. It's been days." Kruger shrugged. Maybe they're waiting, maybe the storms. But a creeping doubt took root. No engine noise, no artillery barrages. The tanks looked more like outlines than machines. He couldn't explain it, but something felt wrong. It didn't matter. Berlin had already committed. The panzers weren't moving. Normandy was still considered a diversion. The Ghost Army didn't need to win the war. It just needed to buy time. And it had. In a tent 5 miles behind the illusion, Sergeant Conway pulled off his headset and leaned back. He rubbed his temples. 3 straight hours of fake radio chatter. "Think they bought it?" Goldman asked. Conway didn't answer, he just listened. In the distance, the rumble of real artillery echoed distant, rolling thunder from Normandy. He smiled. "They're bleeding where we're not." Goldman glanced at the inflatable tank beside them, half deflated in the grass. "Hell of a thing," he muttered, "fighting a war with air and paint." Conway replied without looking. "And winning." The fog hung low over the French countryside in the early hours of June 8, 1944. The sky was pale and cold, the clouds stained with the smoke of burning cities. And still, the Wehrmacht's forward observers at Pas-de-Calais waited. They had orders not to redeploy. Not yet. Not until the Americans committed to their true invasion. What lay in Normandy, they were told, was a feint, a distraction, a clever ploy to draw away Germany's defenses from where the real assault would come. The ghost was still there in the form of the U.S. First Army Group, allegedly under General George S. Patton, massing just across the channel. Every day, Luftwaffe pilots reported the same. Tanks, drugs, barracks, supply depots. Everything pointed to an imminent offensive. And the high command believed it. No one suspected the tanks were rubber. The men actors. The radios lies. The entire army a fiction. It wasn't just about inflatable vehicles. The deception had to breathe. It had to sweat. It had to behave like 30,000 men moving into position for war. To the west of Dover, Corporal Joe Russ walked the perimeter of an empty field with a pair of tire molds strapped to his boots. He dragged a wooden plank behind him, carving tread marks into the dirt. Each step he took left behind the perfect impression of a Sherman tank's weight. Beside him, Private Alan Fletcher laid down fake fuel drums and stacked crates filled with nothing but rocks. From the sky, it would all look exactly right. A half-mile away, engineers unspooled telephone wire between tents that didn't house soldiers, but mannequins. From a distance, the silhouettes moved just enough in the breeze to fool a flyby. And every single detail mattered. If one tree cast the wrong shadow on a tarp, if one dummy had boots that didn't reflect light like leather, the entire illusion could crack. But it didn't crack. Because the Germans weren't just seeing it. They were hearing it too. From a hidden radio truck buried in the forest near the Channel coast, Staff Sergeant Marvin Lewis tapped out a false briefing for a phantom logistics officer. Fuel convoy delayed from Southampton by 6 hours. Recommend rerouting east. Repeat, reroute east. The message wasn't meant for any American unit. It was for the Germans. It was sent in perfect Allied protocol, bounced off legitimate networks, wrapped in the usual encryption, just sloppy enough to be intercepted by German SIGINT. Within hours, Luftwaffe surveillance flights altered their routes. Wehrmacht truck movements were redirected. Entire divisions held in place based on those signals. And that was the point. The Ghost Army didn't need to fight. It just needed to be believed. By June 9th, Berlin intelligence analysts were confident. The first U.S. Army group was real. The Calais sector remained the likely point of attack. Normandy, despite the bloodbath, was a diversion. High Command refused to move the 15th Army. They left 19 divisions, 150,000 men parked north of Paris, waiting for Patton's tanks. Patton himself wasn't even there. His headquarters was a canvas-covered circus of fake radio operators, motor pool clerks transmitting ghost logistics, and sound engineers playing the noises of armored units moving at night. They dragged loudspeakers through fields, broadcasting engine growls and metallic treads onto empty roads. At dawn, locals swore they'd heard an armored division pass in the dark. No one had. In a castle-turned headquarters outside Reims, a German colonel scoured aerial photos by candlelight. Every piece of evidence told him the same story. Patton was coming. Even the chatter from resistance cells suggested reinforcements were massing near Dover. Codebreakers in Bletchley had planted that intelligence weeks earlier. It was all part of the same orchestra: fake tanks, fake units, fake reports, fake panic. And it worked. While the Allies bled across hedgerows in Normandy, the Wehrmacht's most powerful units sat still, listening for signs of an attack that would never come. Not everything about the deception was flawless. On June 10th, a Luftwaffe reconnaissance pilot dipped lower than expected on a pass over the Pas-de-Calais region. He caught the angle just right and saw a Sherman tank's turret shiver in the wind. He radioed back shaken. Possible dummy tanks, canvas construction, request verification. The report made it to a general's desk, but it was dismissed. Too many other sources contradicted it. Too many spies, too many intercepts, too much convincing noise. The illusion held. The Ghost Army had become real, not because it existed, but because the Germans needed it to. A few days later, Sergeant Lewis sat by his console, listening to German transmissions intercepting their own false signals. He could hear them, analyzing, rebroadcasting, panicking. He lit a cigarette, leaned back, and muttered, "They're playing the game we wrote." His partner laughed, and we didn't even have to use bullets. But he was wrong. The bullets were being fired, just not here. In Normandy, the real armies advanced inch by inch, the ground soaked red. And all of it made possible by a war that was never fought, against an army that never existed. The first week of July 1944 passed in a haze of heat and static. The beaches at Normandy had been secured, and the American push inland had begun. Every hedgerow was a fortress. Every orchard bled. But still, High Command in Berlin refused to shift the armored division stationed near Calais. They waited, they watched, they listened. And what they heard confirmed everything they feared. The real hammer had not yet fallen. Intercepted transmissions crackled with urgency. Movement reports, resupply delays, requests for bridge construction. Dozens of signal lines painted the picture of an American armored juggernaut massing across the channel. It wasn't real. But it was loud. loud enough to drown out reality. At a small base near Dover, Sergeant Leo Conway stood beside a rack of captured German field radios. They were rebroadcasting the very lies he and his team had planted hours earlier, relayed, analyzed, and believed. He stared at one as it chirped and clicked with a new burst of activity. Confirmation of bridgehead east of Boulogne, a voice whispered in German. Artillery confirmed dug in. Estimated strength, 2 corps. Conway turned to Corporal Goldman. That's us they're talking about. Goldman glanced out the tent flap toward the empty field, where 6 dozen inflatable tanks sat half-deflated in the sun, sagging like old circus tents. Strange, he muttered, being accused of war crimes by ghosts. In occupied France, panic bloomed in all the wrong places. The German 15th Army was still frozen in position, tasked with defending against a specter. Field Marshal von Rundstedt had begged for weeks to redeploy those forces south to crush the Normandy breakout, but Hitler was convinced Calais remained the real target. Patton was coming. No one could dislodge the idea, not even truth. Because every time Berlin questioned the plan, new evidence surfaced, a fresh photo, a new intercepted signal, more confirmation. Every piece planted by the Ghost Army. In one of the makeshift HQs along the southeastern coast of England, Private Peter Kovacs adjusted the settings on a massive sound playback unit wired to loudspeakers facing an empty forest. Tank engines growled in sequence, the crunch of treads, the creak of turrets rotating, the clatter of tracked columns shifting across gravel. The audio was perfect, professionally engineered at Fort Knox, recorded from real tank units. It had been stitched together into 30-minute loops timed to dawn and dusk, the hours German scouts were most likely to be listening. And even the birds reacted. Across the channel, a farmer swore he saw tank tracks in the soil one morning. He reported them to a resistance cell, who passed them up to British intelligence, who flagged it to the Germans. The Ghost Army hadn't just fooled their enemies. It had fooled their own allies. By mid-July, German logistics officers were diverting rail cars away from Normandy. Their priority was shoring up the Calais sector, preparing for the hammerstroke that never came. The irony was bitter. Allied troops in Normandy were begging for German panzers to be relocated north. Every day those divisions stayed frozen gave Eisenhower's armies more time to punch through France. Every day the Ghost Army lied, real soldiers lived. And yet there was tension inside the deception units too. Not everyone enjoyed the work. Corporal Nate Goldman stared at a deflated half-track shell, his boot nudging a collapsed wheel. It looked like a snake's skin, long, rubbery, empty. I used to paint Broadway backdrops, he said quietly to no one. Dragons, castles, fire-breathing demons, this is better. Sergeant Conway joined him, arms crossed, sweat soaking his shirt. You'd rather paint war. I'd rather end it. Conway lit a cigarette, looking toward the sea. Then keep lying, they're buying every word. He didn't say what he was thinking, that while the deception was working, real men were still dying. Normandy was a meat grinder. The best they could do was keep it from becoming worse. By August, the illusion began to collapse, not because the Germans had seen through it, but because reality had overtaken them. The Allies broke out of Normandy. Operation Cobra shattered the hedgerows. Patton, the real Patton, was unleashed across France, not from Calais, but from the very place the Germans had deemed a trick. And still, Hitler refused to believe it. The 15th Army remained locked in place for days after the breakout, guarding against a threat that had never existed. Entire divisions had never fired a shot, not a bullet, not a shell. They had been held hostage by canvas tanks and fake radio operators. In a small radio post east of the Seine, Sergeant Marvin Lewis packed up his equipment. The last transmission had gone out. The Ghost Army was being disbanded. Their work for now was done. As he coiled the last cable, he paused. Somewhere miles away, a platoon of paratroopers was limping through the wreckage of a bombed-out village. Somewhere else, a tank crew was replacing their third tread in a week under sniper fire. And he had spent the war with rubber and static. He shut the case. They'd never know him. But they might be alive because of him. The retreat from France was not a maneuver. It was a collapse. German columns jammed the roads, horses dragging broken limbers, fuel trucks abandoned, officers shouting orders that couldn't be heard over the engine noise and panic. But north of the Seine, the 15th Army still sat in place. Still watching Calais. Still listening for an invasion that wasn't coming. General Hans Spadel sat in a stone farmhouse 20 kilometers inland, eyes sunken, uniform stained with sweat and cigarette ash. For weeks he had warned Berlin. Normandy was not a feint. It was the main thrust. But each time he made the case, he was countered with fresh intelligence. New Allied units spotted in Kent, more tanks reported, encrypted messages confirmed by 2 separate SIGINT teams. A massive American corps was poised to strike. Any day now. He lit another cigarette with shaking fingers. And still no attack. 100 miles across the channel, Corporal Peter Kovacs packed away the last of the camouflage nets. The inflatable tanks were already being loaded into trucks, flat, deflated, anonymous. He walked past a pile of fake artillery emplacements and sound gear, all being broken down with mechanical efficiency. No speeches, no parades. Just the quiet dismantling of a lie. The Ghost Army was dissolving into the mist. By mid-August, Paris was in open revolt. American armor thundered through the countryside. The Red Ball Express choked the roads behind them with fuel, shells, food, radios, wire, more wire than anyone had seen in one place since the war began. And still in bunkers near Calais, German officers waited. They couldn't believe it. Wouldn't believe it. Until it was too late. At an old Luftwaffe airstrip in Belgium, a German intelligence officer reviewed his own transcripts in silence. He had been the one who validated half the traffic now proven false. He'd heard the call signs, logged the callouts, watched the patterns. It had all made sense. It had all felt real. But the invasion had never come. The so-called 1st U.S. Army Group was gone. Erased. Like chalk washed from a blackboard. He threw the binder against the wall. In a London flat repurposed as an Allied planning cell, a young woman from Bletchley sat at a desk covered in German intercepts. She marked one line in red pencil. Enemy armored concentrations at Dover dispersed, likely reorganization for follow-on attack. It was August 28th. The real invasion had begun 83 days earlier. The Germans still believed the fake one was coming. She leaned back, exhausted, and smiled. The math had worked. The lie had lasted long enough. Deep in Bavaria, in the Führer bunker beneath the Berghof, Hitler raged over maps that no longer matched reality. His generals begged him to release the 15th Army, to redeploy the divisions that had waited too long. He refused. They still don't see it, he said. It's a trick. Let the Allies believe they had fooled him. Let them bleed in Normandy. Outside Reims, Staff Sergeant Marvin Lewis sat in a jeep waiting for orders. The Ghost Army had been reassigned to a new mission, another deception, this time in the Ardennes. He was tired, his boots were rotting, his voice was gone from weeks of fake broadcasts. But the war wasn't over. And there were still lies to be told. The road through Belgium was slick with mud and diesel, the night sky stained orange with distant fires. Trucks rolled east in endless convoys, real tanks this time, real men, real steel. But somewhere between Namur and Bastogne, a canvas tarp still flapped in the wind, tied over what looked like a half-track. It was left behind by accident, a forgotten ghost, deflated and sagging against the roadside brush. No one stopped for it. The war was moving too fast. Corporal Peter Kovacs rode in the back of a truck loaded with coiled speaker cable and generator parts. His fingernails were black with grease, his boots stiff from dried mud. A few yards away, Sergeant Leo Conway smoked in silence, one hand resting on a case of carefully packed sound recordings. They were being deployed again, but no one would say exactly where, only that there would be another deception, another illusion. The Ardennes maybe, or further east. They had tricked the Wehrmacht once. They could do it again. But the deception had begun to shift. No longer a mask for invasion, now it was a shield for survival. The Germans were desperate, fractured, erratic. Their generals argued in bunkers. Their infantry begged for fuel. Their radios crackled with orders that contradicted themselves. And still, even now, they chased shadows. In one intercepted message, a German officer reported a new American armored group appearing near Metz. There were no such units there, only speakers, only noise, only tire tracks stamped by boots and wooden frames. The lie had outlived its creators. Back in London, an officer from MI5 reviewed a report stamped ultra, most secret. It detailed German troop movements from the first week of August to the last. Entire regiments shifted in reaction to units that did not exist. The officer shook his head slowly, then picked up a pen and wrote across the top of the page. Strategic deception success rate, total. In a farmhouse outside Chartres, General Omar Bradley listened to his intelligence chief explain how a single phony convoy had delayed a German counterattack by 3 days. Bradley didn't smile, he simply said, "Good, that saved 1,000 men." He looked out the window at a column of real tanks roaring past in the dust. Let them keep chasing ghosts. In Germany, the reality was finally starting to sink in. The 15th Army had been stood down. Hitler was furious, not because of the defeat in France, but because he had been deceived. He raged at his generals, screamed at his intelligence chiefs, ordered arrests, accused his own staff of betrayal. But none of them had betrayed him. They had simply believed what they saw, what they heard, what they were meant to believe. The canvas tanks had done their job. The radios had spoken their lines. The illusion had become truth, and then turned to smoke. At a depot in southern Belgium, Sergeant Conway helped unload the last of the sound gear. He placed each reel carefully in its crate, labeled them with unit numbers that had never existed, and locked the lid. Nearby, a squad of infantry passed by, the real kind. Mud on their faces, rifles slung over their shoulders, eyes hollow from days of marching. One of them stopped and nodded toward the equipment. "Didn't know there was a band on the front line." Conway didn't look up. "There is." The soldier laughed, then moved on. Weeks later in Paris, a captured German officer was interrogated by Allied intelligence. He had been stationed at Calais during the summer. When asked why his unit never moved to support Normandy, he answered flatly, "Because Patton was going to invade." But Patton was in Normandy. The officer shook his head. "No, we saw him in Calais. We heard him on the radio." He meant it. He believed it. Even as Paris fell, even as German columns burned in the Falaise Gap, even as the Allies crossed the Seine, he still believed. The Ghost Army was never credited in dispatches. Their battles weren't recorded in official tallies. They never held a line or took a hill. They never even fired a shot. But they moved armies. They reshaped maps. They delayed panzers and redirected shells. They won time, and time saved lives. inflatable tanks, fake tire tracks, phantom radios, paint and paper and sound. And against all logic it worked. When the war finally ended, most of the Ghost Army's missions were buried under classification. For decades, no one spoke of it. Peter Kovacs went home and taught theater. Marvin Lewis became a sound engineer in New York. Leo Conway never touched a radio again. But sometimes, late at night, they would hear a click of static, a distant engine rumble, the hiss of compressed air inflating a shape in the dark. They'd hear it in their dreams. The war that never was. The army that never existed. The battles fought with silence and illusion. And they would smile not out of pride, but because they knew the truth. The Bavarian Spring came early in 1946. Snowmelt ran through the gutters of small towns, and the first green buds bloomed on trees that had once lined streets flattened by bombs. Germany, though not yet divided by wall or wire, already felt hollowed, not just in its cities but in its memory. Some wounds were healing, others were disappearing entirely. In a decommissioned military records office near Wiesbaden, two clerks in wool coats shuffled boxes of captured documents. Most were faded by moisture or burnt at the edges. A few were stamped with high-clearance sigils, full of frantic annotations from the final days of the war, enemy sightings, strange transmissions, aerial photos misfiled or left unexplained. One folder had no cover page. Inside, someone had written by hand, Patton's Calais Corps. There were maps, scribbled orders, photographs of tanks that never moved, signal logs tracking non-existent regiments. One of the clerks paused. Why weren't these units ever found? His supervisor, older, eyes sunken from years of sorting a war no one wanted to look at anymore, just stared at the page. They weren't units, he muttered. They were echoes. Thousands of miles away in a post office in Ohio, Peter Kovacs pulled a battered canvas duffel from storage. He hadn't touched it in a year. Not since London. Not since they disbanded the team. He unzipped it slowly. Inside were reels of magnetic tape, a reel-to-reel deck with cracked casing, and a rolled photograph of a field full of inflatable Sherman tanks standing perfectly still in the English mist. He turned the deck on. It clicked, hummed. A low rumble filled the room, recorded engine noise, the kind they'd used at night in Pas-de-Calais to fake a moving armored column. It played like a lullaby now. He turned it off and sat back in the quiet. No one ever wrote about them. No citations. No parades. But that was the job. Their war was made of absence. In 1947, during one of the early Nuremberg follow-up interrogations, a German colonel from Army Group B asked a question no one had an answer for. What happened to the divisions near Dover, the ones we intercepted, Patton's Corps? He was told firmly that no such corps had existed. The colonel laughed. I walked the tracks myself, he said. I saw the prints. We rerouted an entire panzer reserve because of it. He wasn't lying. He had seen them. Tracks laid by boots and planks. Barrel shadows painted with wax. Audio recordings played from tree lines at dusk. He didn't know it, but he'd been part of one of the greatest performances in modern history. In the decades that followed, silence hardened around the Ghost Army. Some men died before the story was ever declassified. Others lived long enough to see themselves described in newly opened archives, names half remembered, radio logs now preserved in acid-free paper. Most remained anonymous. The nature of their war had made them invisible, and not just to the Germans. Even their fellow soldiers didn't know. Leo Conway lived long enough to be asked about it, once, by a college historian who tracked him down after a dusty footnote in an Army Signals Corps report from 1945. They sat in a diner outside Chicago. The historian ordered black coffee. Conway drank nothing. "You helped fake an entire field army," the young man said, half in awe. "You made an illusion so big it changed the shape of Europe." Conway didn't answer right away. He just stared at the window, watching cars pass by. "We didn't think about maps," he said finally. "We thought about keeping guys alive." The historian nodded, scribbling. "But the Germans believed it. They moved divisions based on your transmissions." Conway smiled, dry and tired. "People see what they expect. We just gave them something to stare at." He paid the bill and left before the questions could continue. There were whispers that elements of the Ghost Army had been consulted during Korea. More likely, some of the techniques were borrowed, passed between intelligence departments like recipes, distorted over time, dulled by other priorities. But the original men, the real architects, mostly faded back into the world. Stage designers, painters, engineers, voice actors. Some went into television. Some into advertising. A few never worked in deception again. It was too easy. Too effective. And in the quiet of peacetime, the echo of that kind of power was hard to carry. In 1985, a photograph resurfaced in an auction lot in Normandy, black and white, blurred slightly, showing 3 U.S. soldiers standing beside what looked like a Sherman tank. But the tank's barrel was bent, not battle-damaged, sagging. Rubber. The man in the middle was smiling. The caption read, 23rd HQSD, June 44. It made its way to a small museum in St. Miraglais. The curator placed it in a corner, next to parachute gear and ration tins. Most visitors passed it by. But the veterans who saw it paused. They always paused. And once, one leaned in and whispered, "I watched that thing wobble in the wind, thought I was losing my mind." He was. Even decades later, the German archival community struggled with how to categorize the intelligence failures around Calais. The assessments, in hindsight, looked absurd. Tanks that didn't move, units that never engaged, signal logs with perfect consistency, too perfect. One analyst, writing a classified memo in the late 80s, called it the most expensive ghost story in modern history. But that wasn't quite right. It wasn't a ghost story. It was theater. Carefully staged, precisely timed, deadly serious. And it worked. Peter Kovacs passed away in 1994. In his will, he left a small envelope with a tape reel and a note. "Let them hear it." The sound was played at the National WWII Museum during a private exhibit on deception warfare. 8 minutes of engine noise, footsteps, shouted orders, and the faint clatter of tools on metal. Most visitors didn't recognize it for what it was. But to a trained ear, it was unmistakable. An army moving at night. Except it was. There were no boots, no tanks, no men. Only a handful of artists, sound techs, and wire. In time, the Ghost Army was officially recognized. Medals were awarded, obituaries corrected, honors given, but it came too late for many. Not because they were bitter. Because they never needed it. They hadn't fought to be seen. They had fought to vanish. And in vanishing, they'd shaped history. Even now, military academies around the world teach the operations of Normandy, the breakout, the fall of France. Some mention deception. Fewer mention the 23rd. But occasionally, a cadet will ask, how did the Allies know the Germans would fall for it? And the answer is always the same. They didn't. They gambled. They committed. And they made sure the illusion was good enough to be worth dying for, even if no one did. Their battlefield was fog and misdirection. Their weapon was doubt. Their victory, time. And all they had to do was be believed. They were.